when the expected invasion would come. It was even possible that a series of heavy raids was intended rather than a full-scale invasion, but they could not tell for sure. So while Lord Hume's relatives moulded in prison, Surrey waited and watched. The wily old Surrey delayed mustering his full army until he was sure the Scots army had indeed crossed the border. In those days, the business of feeding an army in the field was a Herculean task, given the primitive supply systems of the day, and bringing together a large force was not something that an experienced commander undertook lightly. Surrey's wisdom was to serve him well. Hard-riding messengers brought the news to York on the 25th of August that the Scots had not crossed the border until the 22nd of August. Only then did Surrey order a full mobilization. For all armies of this period, desertion was an extensive problem. And in addition, once an army was brought together, the men began to die in large numbers, almost immediately, from either malnourishment or the diseases which resulted from the unhygienic camp practices of the day. Smallpox and typhus were particularly virulent killers, and any army assembled in the field quickly began to disappear before the eyes of its frustrated commanders. By delaying his major muster, Surrey avoided these dangers. Surrey expected the Scots to proceed to lay siege to Berwick upon Tweed, as was their usual custom in conflicts between their countries. But he was to be deceived. Instead, they attacked the English border stronghold of Norham Castle. The governor confidently announced that he would hold out long enough for King Henry to return from France if necessary, but Surrey was taking no chances. On the 26th of August, he left York and headed north, gathering troops on the way. By the 30th of August, Surrey was at Durham, where he collected the contingents from the bishopric and the great banner of St. Cuthbert, a potent rallying symbol for the English northerners. 2 days later, Surrey was in Newcastle upon Tyne. Lord Dacre with a large number of English borderers joined him there, but Surrey also heard the disconcerting news that Norham Castle had fallen after a siege of just 5 days. The border was wide open, and there was no time to lose. Surrey next moved northwards to Alnwick. On the 4th of September, he was joined there by his eldest son, the Lord Admiral of England, with 1,210 professional soldiers who had been serving as Marines. Their officers were to be invaluable to Surrey, as were a dozen experienced German gunners who accompanied them. Most of the day of August the 30th was taken up with a planning conference. As the English army was predominantly composed of militiamen, they would soon be clamouring to go home, so there was little time to lose. In any case, both the militia and the regulars were a considerable drain on Surrey's meagre coffers, so it obviously made sense to seek battle as soon as possible. The question was how to do it. For against all expectation, the Scots had not advanced southwards. Indeed, they had barely even crossed the border. Throughout Scotland, the mood was less than confident, and a number of seemingly supernatural portents were observed, the most famous of which was described by a Scots chronicler named Pitscotty.
The king came to Linlithgow very sad and dolorous, making his devotion to God to send him good chance and fortune in his voyage. And there came a man of 50 years, clad in a blue gown, crying and asking for the king, saying that he desired to speak with him. Till at the last he came to the desk before him and said to him in this manner, Sir King, my mother has sent me to thee, desiring thee not to go where thou art purposed. For if thou do, thou shalt not fare well in thy journey, nor none that are with thee. Further she bade thee converse with no woman, nor use their counsel. For if thou do it, thou wilt be confounded and brought to shame. By the time this man had spoken these words to the king, the evensong was near done, and the king paused on these words, studying to give him an answer. But in the meantime, before the king's face, and in the presence of all the lords that were about him at the time, this man vanished away, as if he'd been one blink of the sun, and could no more be seen.
It is perhaps doubtful whether this apparition was as supernatural as Pitt Scotty believed. It may even have been a well-managed publicity stunt arranged by the Queen. The pointed reference to the cause of a woman would certainly support that view. It did not sway James, but it certainly must have added to the unsettling tide of omens against the venture. Still in desperation, the peace party argued Scotland's treaty obligations to France could be fulfilled by border incursions, such as Hume's ill-fated raid, which had seen his relatives captured. However, the king would have none of it, and Bulmer's victory over Hume at Millfield merely added another slight to the king's overdeveloped sense of honour. A full-scale invasion it had to be, and that required a full mobilisation of Scotland's army. Since the time of Bannockburn 200 years before, the barons, the freeholders and the citizens of royal boroughs were obliged to muster themselves and their tenants in their best array for 40 days military service on receipt of a writ from the king. This writ was now duly issued. The barons and freeholders were also obliged to arm and equip their men and to provide for their upkeep during those 40 days. At the end of that period, the king had either to release them and allow them to return home, or else feed and pay for them himself. This system worked well enough for the defence of the kingdom, where those raised were known as fencibles, that is, men capable of bearing arms defensible. For the defence of the realm, the system was fine, but worked less well beyond a strictly local level. One of the reasons for this was the large distances involved meant that those contingents coming from the Highlands and the far north of Scotland had made substantial inroads into their supplies before they even reached the rendezvous at Edinburgh on the 13th of August. Even more importantly, the time spent in marching could not be spent in training for the coming campaign. Even those levies raised nearer to Edinburgh quite understandably delayed their mustering in order not to waste supplies. But of course, having done so, they too found themselves short of time in which to train in the new tactics. A good many of those who did assemble on Edinburgh's Borough Muir were no doubt hardened fighters, even professional soldiers, who were veterans of many a skirmish where individual battle skills counted for everything. Now, however, both they and the raw ploughboys and weavers filling out the ranks had to learn to work together, manoeuvring and fighting in large, tightly packed masses. But they were to have precious little time in which to do it. The army assembled on the Borough Muir was said to be the largest ever assembled in Scotland. Some contemporaries have calculated it as 60,000 strong. A huge host to be assembled for a poor, backward country like Scotland. By the time the two armies eventually met on Flodden Field, they had been reduced by sickness and desertion to not much more than 20,000 men apiece. But while there was little enough between them in terms of numbers, they were two very different armies. The English army, apart from its up-to-date artillery, was still a medieval one, largely made up of billmen and bowmen. But the Scots army was intended to be a very modern Renaissance army. Although the mustering process was unchanged from the days of Bruce and Wallace, the equipment and tactics reflected the very best of current continental practice. In the 14th century, the Swiss infantry, like the Scots, had successfully held their own against the armoured knights who usually dominated medieval battlefields. Unlike the Scots, however, they had then gone on to exploit their Central European position by hiring themselves out to the great powers of the day. Swiss pikemen rapidly earned a savage reputation throughout Europe as doughty and indeed well-nigh unbeatable soldiers. In the meantime, they spawned their imitators, most notably the famous German Landsknechts, mercenaries who fought for the highest bidder. They too fought with long pikes, and one of the ominous signs of Scotland's preparations for war had been the importation of thousands of Landsknecht pikes. At Antwerp, imperial customs officials gloomily reported the large number of pikes bound for Scotland. But as the emperor was not at war with the Scots, they could do nothing to intercept them. With the pikes came 40 experienced officers under a French captain named Dossy. Although these officers are usually described as being Frenchmen, they must actually have been Germans, for their task was to train the Scots levies in the new Landsknecht tactics. James probably believed that it would be an easy task, for the pike was a traditional weapon in Scotland. It turned out to be a fatal miscalculation. The old Scots schiltron was little more than a solid mass of men armed with spears. Originally, it had been a defensive formation, ideally suited for fighting against cavalry. At Falkirk, however, Wallace's 4 great schiltrons had been shot to bloody ribbons by King Edward's longbowmen. Bruce, on the other hand, recognised the spear or pike's potential as an offensive weapon, and at Bannockburn formed his schiltrons, or moving thickets of pikes, into attack columns. This demanded considerably more expertise than simply standing fast in a defensive ring. But Bruce, crucially, had the time to train his men. Indeed, as he waited outside Stirling in the summer of 1314, he rehearsed some of the moves his army was to make in the battle. The result, of course, was a resounding victory at Bannockburn, which secured Scotland's independence for hundreds of years to come. Unfortunately, those Scots armies which later attempted to repeat the success almost invariably came to grief, because they had not had the intensive training which Bruce gave his men, nor an answer to the deadly firepower of the longbar, or latterly the arquebusier, an earlier form of musket. King James thought the answer was to adopt Landesknecht tactics, but in fact this decision merely compounded the problem. Instead of fighting in the huge unwieldy bodies of men characteristic of medieval warfare, the Landsknechts formed smaller, more manoeuvrable units. These were then able to deliver fast-moving assaults, preceded by skirmishers armed with arquebuses. The effectiveness of these tactics, however, depended very heavily upon the training and expertise of the troops involved. The Landsknechts were above all professional soldiers, and therefore well able to reach the required standard of proficiency. The Scots army, however, was effectively a conscript militia, and with only a matter of days at best in which to learn the necessary drills, it was perhaps inevitable that things would go wrong. The French commander, Dossy, and his Landsknecht captains will have been only too well aware of this, and it is likely that the apparent inaction which followed the capture of Norham Castle was a result of training in the works of the Scots army. At any rate, after the surrender of Norham on the 29th of August, the Scots made a leisurely advance southwards. The castles of Ford, Etal and Chillingham were quickly battered into submission, and then James established his army in an entrenched camp on Flodden Edge. The king was afterwards criticised by many chroniclers for apparently dallying with the Lady Heron at Ford Castle instead of striking southwards. James certainly had a reputation as a ladies' man, but the key to the question actually lies in the presence of the Landsknecht captains. The establishment of fortified camps was unprecedented in Scottish military history, but it was a well-tried lands-connect practice. Secure in their mile-long position, the lands-connects worked hard at preparing the raw Scots pikemen for the battle to come. There is perhaps no reason to doubt that King James, a notorious womanizer, was amorously engaged with Lady Heron, notwithstanding the dire warning of that mysterious man in blue who had appeared at Linlithgow. However, while he was thus amusing himself, the professionals were slowly licking his army into shape. The question was whether the professionals would have enough time, for Surrey needed to fight as soon as possible, and he was not about to let the opposing army slip away. On the 5th of September, Surrey sent Rouge Croix, herald to the Scots king. James, he declared, had entered England and slain English subjects without justice or reason, and he was therefore challenged to try the decision of right by force of arms before Friday next, the 9th of September. Rouge Croix was, of course, expected to take a good look at the Scots army while he was delivering the message and waiting for any reply. Such genteel spying was an accepted aspect of the herald's role, providing it was not too blatant, and Surrey anticipated a return visit in due course from one of the Scots heralds. What he did not anticipate was that James would detain Rouge Croix to prevent Surrey from obtaining that vital information until it was too late. Instead, the Scottish Islay herald turned up in Surrey's camp with a formal acceptance of the challenge, was detained in his turn, and then exchanged for Rouge Croix. Only when the English herald returned did Surrey realise that he had committed himself to battle with a foe who was posted in a near impregnable position. An immediate demand that the Scots should descend and meet the English on the open plain of Millfield was treated with contempt, and Surrey therefore found himself in an awkward position. The English army was already running very short of provisions. They'd even run out of beer, and in a few days they would have to disband for want of food. Surrey needed to fight while he still had an army, but attempting to storm a fortified hilltop position was out of the question. He had counted on meeting the Scots in the open field, not 500 feet up on Flodden Edge. The only conceivable approach was from the southeast, along the flat ground between the foot of Flodden Hill and the River Till, a narrow and dangerous defile, sure to be swept by the Scottish artillery. The situation was gloomily described by one of the Northumbrians serving under Lord Dacre.
My Lord Surrey removed 6 miles to a field called Wooler Hall, within 3 miles of the King of Scots, where, as every man might see, the said King of Scots did lie with his army upon an high hill in the edge of Cheviot, within 2 miles of Scotland, enclosed on 3 sides by 3 great mountains, so there was no entry or passage unto him, but one way, where was laid marvellous and great ordnance of guns. Seeing that the King of Scots continued in the mountains, he sent unto him Rouge Cross, pursuivant of arms, and required that he came down into the plain of Millfield, where there was convenient ground for the coming together of 2 armies, or to a ground nearby called Flodden. At this, the king waxed angry with my lord, and would not speak with Rouge Cross, but had his message by report, and sent reply by a gentleman in these terms: The king, my master, wills that ye show to the Earl of Surrey that it beseemeth him not, being an earl, so largely to attempt a great prince. His grace will take and hold his ground and field at his own pleasure, and not at the assigning of the Earl of Surrey.
Unwilling to admit defeat without a blow having been struck, Surrey now resolved to try and manoeuvre the Scots out of their position. In so doing, he was running a terrible risk. His plan was to march around the eastern flank of the Scots position and take up a position between Flodden Edge and the Scottish border. If his communications with Scotland were thus cut, the king might then be compelled to come down and give battle. However, such a flank march in the presence of a watchful enemy might easily come to grief, and if the expected battle went badly, the remains of Surrey's army would be trapped between the victorious Scots and the River Tweed. Nevertheless, Surrey considered that he had no choice, and on the 8th he moved his hungry army from Wooler to Barmore Wood, facing the east end of the Scottish position. It was a short march of only 2 miles, but it brought his army into its jumping-off point.
My Lord Surrey marched the 8th day of September, being Our Lady's Day, the Nativity, and passed over the waters of Till, and lodged that night under a woodside called Barmore Wood, directly against the king and his army, albeit there was a hill between the two hosts for avoiding the danger of gunshot, and notwithstanding that for 4 or 5 days before there had been little or no wine, ale, nor beer for the people to refresh themselves with, and the whole army, for the most part, was enforced and constrained to drink water for the same time and season, with no comfort or trust of relief in that behalf. My Earl of Surrey and the army, the danger and the want of drink notwithstanding, courageously advanced forward to get between the King of Scots and his realm of Scotland.
That night, Surrey issued his final orders. The vanguard and the artillery, led by his son the Lord Admiral, was to move northwards and cross the River Till by Twizel Bridge, while Surrey himself led the remainder over the river by a ford at Milford. Next morning, having eaten the last of their rations, they set off at 5 o'clock. The northward move appears to have taken the Scots by surprise. The border reivers, who were acting as scouts, were off raiding villages to the south, and suddenly, at this critical point, King James and his officers were blind. What was Surrey up to? One possibility was that he was simply moving towards Berwick in order to obtain supplies and establish a shorter line of communications. More worryingly, however, he might just as easily be intent on invading Scotland. This, however, could be discounted. The Scots were well aware of the parlous state of Surrey's forces. The northwards move must still therefore be aimed at bringing about a battle on the 9th. But instead of launching a suicidal frontal assault, he was intending to attack the Scots' position from behind. This assessment was agreed by one Giles Musgrave, an English outlaw acting as a guide for King James. He pointed out that Surrey was almost certainly intending to seize Braxton Hill, the more northerly of the 3 protecting James's position. It was separated from Flodden Hill only by a slight dip, so that if Surrey did succeed in planting his army upon it, he would nullify the Scots' advantage. Indeed, he might even stand on the defensive, forcing the Scots to attack him in order to clear their line of communications. James acted decisively. If this was indeed what Surrey intended, he still had several hours in which to act. Ordering his men to set fire to all the straw and litter in the great camp, he set his army in motion under cover of the resulting smokescreen. The Flodden position was abandoned, and instead the Scots moved a short distance to the northwest to take up a fresh position on Braxton Hill, thus denying it to the enemy, just at the moment when the Admiral's division was struggling to deploy across the Broxburn, a swampy stream. It was not too difficult for his infantry to wade through the morass, but the Admiral had all of the English guns in his charge, and these could only be brought across the narrow causeway known as Brank's Bridge. The unexpected appearance of the Scots on the hill above him came as a shock. His father, with the main body, was still some distance to the east, coming over the Till at Sandyford. It was now about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and defeat was staring the English in the face. Tearing an Agnus Dei medal from his chest, he sent an urgent message to his father, imploring him to make haste. King James determined to seize his opportunity. The Admiral's division was hastily deployed into line of battle, but it was outflanked and separated from the rest of the English army. As a result, it was dangerously exposed, and James saw that he had an opportunity to defeat the English in detail. Any thought of fighting a defensive battle was rejected in favour of hasty, downhill assault. The deployment of the Scots army at Flodden reflected the teaching of the Landsknecht captains. In place of the 3 traditional huge divisions of medieval warfare, the vanward or advanced guard, the main battle, and the rear ward, each drawing up in line from the right, King James's army was organised in 5 smaller divisions. Each of these divisions was in turn made up of 2 or more brigades of pikemen. If Landsknecht practice was being followed, each of these brigades would be preceded by a line of skirmishers, the Verlenhoop, or Forlorn Hope. Most of these skirmishers seem to have been armed with arquebuses, but some may have been Highland archers. On the left of the army, and facing the Admiral, was a division commanded by the Earls of Hume and Huntly. Some of the men in Huntly's brigade may have been Highlanders, but like Hume, he also held large estates in the borders, and most of his contingent came from Berwickshire. The next division comprised brigades led by the Earl of Errol, Constable of Scotland, and the Earls of Crawford and Montrose. The men of this division had been raised in the north-east of Scotland, and the other lowland shires north of the Firth of Forth. In the centre stood the largest division, commanded by the king himself. This naturally included his own personal retinue and the usual cloud of aristocratic hangers-on who can be relied upon to congregate around the throne. But the bulk of the men in this division were raised in the west of Scotland by the Earls of Glencairn and Cassilis, and the Lords Herries and Maxwell. A short distance to the rear of this division was a brigade of Lothian levies, led by the Earl of Bothwell, and on their right flank stood a division of Highlanders, led by the Earls of Lennox and Argyll. There had been a considerable amount of desertion since the army left Edinburgh, and each of the 4 main divisions probably mustered no more than 5,000 men, while Bothwell had half that number, making a grand total of about 22,000 men in the Scots army. This was about the same size as Surrey's force. The Scottish advance was made in echelon, with the left-hand division leading. A sudden shower of rain had made the grass slopes slippery, and many of the Scots pikemen took off their boots in an effort to maintain some sort of grip. All, however, came down the hill in the Almain, or German fashion, that is, without shouting or noise. The Borderers made good speed, and long before the other divisions came into contact, they crashed into the Admiral's right wing. On the Admiral's right was a brigade of about 3,000 men commanded by his brother Edmund Howard. Half of them came from Cheshire and Lancashire, while the rest were a fairly mixed bag of Marines and a small contingent from South Yorkshire. In the centre, commanded by the Admiral himself, stood some 9,000 men. Some were Marines clad in the royal livery of green and white, but the greater part of them came from Northumberland, Durham and North Yorkshire. On his left was a very much smaller brigade, commanded by the 70-year-old Sir Marmaduke Constable. This comprised 1,000 levies from Lancashire and an equal number from Northumberland and Yorkshire, as the Scots came down the hill towards them. Most of Edmund Howard's brigade broke and fled. It was said that the Cheshire men resented being placed under the command of a Howard instead of one of their beloved Stanleys. But whatever the reason, their desertion left the rest of the brigade horribly exposed. Elated, the 2 Scots brigade commanded by Hume and Huntly rolled over them. English casualties were heavy, and Edmund Howard himself came close to being captured.
fiercely did set about Master Edmund Howard, captain of the uppermost part of the field on the western side, and between them was so cruel a battle that many of our men of Cheshire and others did flee. So in manner, Master Edmund was left alone and without succour, and his standard and the bearer of the same beaten and hewn in pieces, and he himself right strapped to the ground. Howbeit, like a courageous and hardy, lusty young gentleman, he recovered again and fought hand to hand with one Sir Davy Hume and slew him with his own hand. Thus, Master Edmund was in great peril and danger until the Lord Dacre, like a good and trusty knight, came to his relief and gave succour unto him.
To add to the initial Scots success, the Admiral was now being menaced by a second Scots division, that led by the Earl of Errol. Assailed in front and flank at the same time, the Admiral's defeat would have been certain. But in fact, Hume and Huntley failed to exploit their victory. After the victory on the right, it took some time to reorganise their victorious forces before they could move against the English centre. It is in this area that discipline, training and good officers count for everything. Yet this was exactly what the Scots lacked. Eventually, they were pulled back into some sort of order, and Huntley proposed that they should then fall upon the exposed flank of the Admiral's main battle. But by that time, Surrey had sent Lord Dacre's English borderers to his son's assistance, and Hume insisted on facing them instead. This delay and subsequent inactivity proved fatal to the Earl of Errol and his division. With only 5,000 men, it was outnumbered almost 2 to 1 by the 9,000 men of the Admiral's main battle, and a counterattack by Sir Marmaduke Constable's brigade completed Errol's discomfiture. With all their leaders slain, the Scots of Errol's division retreated back up the hill to rejoin those under Hume and Huntley. Effectively, there was not one, but 2 battles being fought out on the slopes below Branxton Hill that evening. The Admiral had decisively won his battle, and it now remained to be seen how his father would fare against the King. At the outset of the battle, the King's beloved artillery, commanded by Robin Borthwick, had been quite effective. When Dacre was ordered to go to the Admiral's assistance, Borthwick laid down a barrage which routed the levies from Tynedale and Bamburghshire, before Nicholas Appleyard managed to bring the English guns into action. Some of Appleyard's guns were tasked with counter-battery fire, while the others successfully engaged the King's division, which was still making its way down the hill towards Surrey's men. The crisis of the battle was approaching. King James dismounted from his horse, and snatching up a pike, placed himself in the front rank of his division. It was quite traditional for pikemen to be led on by their officers, but James was no Lands-Connacht captain. He was a king, and more importantly, a commander-in-chief. His place was in the saddle directing the battle. However inspiring his action, by placing himself in the front rank, he relinquished all control over his mighty army, and arguably threw away any chance of winning the battle. It may simply have been one of those impetuous decisions for which he was notorious, but it is more likely that James never had any intention of directing the struggle once battle was joined. Both armies were more or less equal in numbers, and it was to be a straightforward fight to the death. Death came quickly to many in the King's division. As they came down the slope, the rest of Nicholas Appleyard's gunners switched from counter-battery fire to the altogether much more tempting target presented by the massed ranks of Scots pikemen. They could hardly miss. It was just as well for Surrey that his guns were so effective. for the vaunted English longbowmen were for once ineffective. The men in the front ranks of the Scottish formations were well armoured, and as one chronicler remarked, they were most assuredly harnessed and abode the most dangerous shot of arrows, which sore annoyed them. Yet except it hit them in some bare place, did them no hurt. Furthermore, many of the archers found their bowstrings had become damp, and their bows were therefore less effective. Yet the same showers which wet the bowstrings also proved the Scots' undoing. Lanzknecht tactics were brutally direct. Once they were committed to action, the front ranks levelled their pikes shoulder high and moved forward as fast as the ground would allow. It was rare for their pikeheads to actually penetrate the armour and thick protective clothing worn by the opposing infantry. But what they aimed to do was, quite literally, knock them over by sheer impetus. Once the enemy were down, pikes would be discarded and swords used to finish off the now helpless men as they struggled to rise and flee. To do this, however, required a firm grip underfoot, speed, and perfect discipline. All three were lacking at Flodden. In the first place, even though many Scots had taken their boots off, the wet grass made the steep slope treacherously slippery. And then a slight boggy dip immediately in front of Surrey's position combined with this to prevent the Scots coming forward at the steady trot favoured by the Landsknechts. A lack of discipline and the effects of Appleyard's artillery fire also tended to break up the Scots' formations, lessening the eventual impact still further. Consequently, when the King's division actually came into collision with Surrey's stationary men, the English kept their footing and held their ground. The long pikes were now useless, and the Scots quickly discarded them and took to their swords, but they were at a terrible disadvantage against the English bills. Then Bothwell brought his reserve brigade down the hill and into the melee, seemingly without affecting the outcome. It seems he may simply have fed his men into the already stationary mass. Nevertheless, a brutal fight ensued, in which neither side gave nor asked for quarter. The Scots leaders were so well armoured that not only were they virtually impervious to arrows, but they were such large and stout men that one witness commented they did not fall even when struck by 4 or 5 bills. Unlike Bothwell's ineffectual intervention in the centre, the English admiral's action was to prove decisive. Having reorganised his division after their victory over Errol's men, he turned and crashed into the flank and rear of the King's division. The arrival of this new force seems to have decided the issue in the centre, and Scots' resistance collapsed. Most of the lightly equipped soldiers in the rear of the columns probably made their way back up the hill without too much difficulty, but there was no escape for the heavily armoured leaders in the front ranks. Amongst those who died was King James himself. Trying to cut his way through to meet Surrey, he had his helmet beaten off, was wounded in the face by an arrow, and finally hacked to death by an unknown billman. A less than chivalrous end for a king who would only expect to be dispatched by an equal. But in the heat of the fury, few could yet know the fate of the king. Up on Brankston Hill, one last Scots division remained to be committed. The Highlanders, led by Lennox and Argyle. For some reason, they had remained on the hill throughout the battle. James may have neglected to give them any orders, or more probably perhaps because they had little armour and no pikes, he all along intended them to remain in reserve. At any rate, seeing the King's division in trouble, they had just started to move down the slope in order to cover its retreat when they were hit in the flank by an English brigade led by Sir Edward Stanley. Scrambling up the side of the hill unseen, Stanley's archers poured a hasty volley into the unsuspecting Highlanders. The result was devastating. Lennox and Argyle were both killed. The Highlanders made a half-hearted attempt to counterattack, but were then driven pell-mell down the hill and across the ground where the King's division had just been beaten. Surrey's men were in no condition to intercept them, however, and the survivors got clean away when their pursuers fell to plundering the dead. Night was falling by now, and both armies wearily withdrew to their original positions. Surrey, falling back on Barmore, knew that he had won the battle, and may even have known that the King of the Scots was dead. But neither he nor his army were in any condition to finish the job by taking on Hume and Huntley's unbeaten brigades. Surrey's victory had been dearly bought, and if his payrolls are reliable, some 1,500 of his men died at Flodden, besides as many more who had run away when the right wing collapsed. Furthermore, the survivors who had marched all day and fought well into the night were still desperately short of supplies, and when they reached Barmore village, they were disgusted to find their own camp plundered by those men who had earlier run away. Up on Branxton Hill, surrounded by the dead and wounded, Hume and Huntley spent a still more sombre night. Although they had won their own fight and held their brigades together, it was obvious that disaster had overwhelmed the rest of the army. As the shocked survivors assembled in the darkness, the full extent of that disaster gradually became apparent. In the thin light of dawn, the Scots came down off the hill once more, but this time, abandoning their camp and most of their artillery, they retreated northwards, back across the Tweed and into Scotland. Behind them, they left upwards of 3,000 dead, including their king, 8 earls, and 13 barons. Nearly every nobleman who had followed him down that fatal slope. A whole generation of the country's leaders had been wiped out. There was scarce a family in Scotland not touched by the tragedy. One man had 7 sons slain at Flodden. As they awaited news in Edinburgh, a terrible wailing rose from the streets as the women's folk looked for a sign of departed sons and husbands. So terrible were their cries that a proclamation was passed which read, "All women are to pass to their labours, and not be seen upon the gate, clamouring and crying, under pain of banishment from the city." In her palace at Linlithgow, Queen Margaret and her infant son waited for news in the high tower which to this day has been known as Queen Margaret's Tower. Eventually, a worn-out messenger arrived in Edinburgh, nearly dead with fatigue. He carried the terrible news. "The king is slain, and with him the flower of Scotland."
We are going to hear a brand new interview with President Biden tonight. He just sat down with Stephanie Ruhle for an MSNBC exclusive. This is one of those things where they just fed in the tapes. What you're seeing just happened. And you will only hear this exclusive on MSNBC tonight, including starting this hour when Stephanie joins us live with the first excerpt. There's no bigger interview in American government or politics, and we and Stephanie have you covered with that coming up. Tonight, I also have more in our reporting on the expanding scandals swirling around Clarence Thomas and his controversial activist wife. New revelations about her secret payments furtively provided from a Republican-connected insider. We're going to get into that and what has become basically a pile of questions for not only Clarence Thomas, but his colleagues on the court. What are they going to do about it? We're going to get into that later tonight. It's One of those very newsy Fridays from the Supreme Court all the way over to the White House, as you can see. But right now, the top story is what you see here. This is brand new. This is the video Donald Trump did not want anyone to see. It's the former president forced under oath to answer questions about an alleged assault in his civil defamation and rape trial. What you see right here for the first time tonight is this brand new footage from that case. And unlike, say, Donald Trump's arraignment and what will be the process at his upcoming scheduled criminal trial, where there were a few photographs that showed him right before the arraignment began, but there are no video cameras allowed in that proceeding in New York criminal court. But here, tonight, you can see that the cameras were rolling, which is exactly the scenario that Trump was trying to prevent with his defiance and delay tactics, just as he has ran from testifying to Bob Mueller or the January 6th committee or the New York AG probe. But here he got cornered, forced under oath, as you can see right there. And you can see from him talking, about to play some of this, that he did not plead the fifth as he and others have done in other proceedings. Instead, here, he responds. He parries questions about his alleged conduct in this taped deposition in the civil rape case. And we knew the jury had seen this tape this week. But now tonight, what's different is, according to the process, it is now public for the first time. So this video evidence is now publicly available. And Trump was pressed on the account by his accuser. He denies all charges. And he was pressed on his own apparent admissions on the infamous Access Hollywood tape. Here is some of the new deposition.
In this video, I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the you can do anything. That's what you said, correct?
Well, historically, that's true with stars.
True with stars that they can grab women by the
Well, that's what it's. If you look over the last million years, I guess that's been largely true. Not always, but largely true. Unfortunately or fortunately.
And you consider yourself to be a star?
I think you can say that, yeah.
So you saw right there, the lawyer garners a type of admission because Trump stands accused of what he asserted or claimed stars could do, and then directly thereafter, he puts himself in that same star category. The lawyer also pressed Donald Trump about claims that the accuser was not his, quote, type, which draws this very controversial new exchange where you see Donald Trump discuss his, quote, first choice for this type of scenario. And that is something he uses in his alleged or apparent defense. So he's talking about his choice as a defense against what he stands accused of. And then you'll be able to hear as he turns this same verbiage on the lawyer in the room questioning him.
She would not be my first choice, that I can tell you. Man. You don't know. That would not be my first choice.
When you said in that video that Ms. Leeds would not be your first choice, you were referring to her physical looks, correct?
Just the overall. I look at her, I see her, I hear what she says, whatever. You wouldn't be a choice of mine either, to be honest with you. I hope you're not insulted. I would not, under any circumstances, have any interest in you. I'm honest when I say it.
It is legally irrelevant, also obviously quite offensive, to turn the discussion and try to attack the attorney. But that statement there might also hurt Donald Trump with a jury that is being asked to weigh, in the context of this civil trial, his alleged misogyny and his alleged conduct. I want to bring in our expert tonight, which is an attorney, Sunny Hostin, also a 3-time Emmy-winning legal journalist. You may know her as a co-host of The View. She's also an author in her own right, a New York Times best-selling author with a new novel, Summer on Sag Harbor. So much to get to.
Yes.
But first, I give you the floor to respond to what we just heard there.
Wow. Well, I think you know this, Ari. My specialty when I was at the Department of Justice was trying crimes against women, crimes against the elderly, and sex crimes in particular, and child trafficking. And so he appears to be deeply unlikable in that deposition, and oftentimes jurors want to determine whether or not they find someone truthful, likable, believable. He fails in all of those three categories immediately just from that deposition. And oftentimes attorneys will tell you everything that you say can and will be held against you in a court of law. I guarantee you that there are going to be women on that jury, even men on that jury, that are going to despise him because of what he just said.
And to dig into it in the context of this case,
yeah,
is it legally effective to try to win or defend against what he's accused of by getting into what he would argue is a, quote, choice or romantic appraisal, when the real question is, did you sexually assault someone? It's not a scenario where we're discussing even your, quote, choice or dating preference.
Well, it's going to be harmful to him because if the prosecutor or the civil attorney rather has any chops, they will explain to the jury that rape is not about looks. Rape is not about, whether or not you like someone. Rape is about power. And it's very clear on this tape that he is saying as a star, he has the power to do whatever he would like to do to a woman. That is the classic definition of a rapist. So I think that type of admission is going to be very, very harmful. I mean, if I were trying that case, I would feel like I just hit the jackpot.
Wow. It's very interesting hearing from you directly on that exact point. Then we have more of how he tries to parry and do his thing. And again, I mentioned this in emphasizing in our reporting, there's plenty of Trump where he's trying to be in the spotlight and get the attention.
Yes.
That's sort of the PR Trump. This is exactly what he's been avoiding, and I gave examples, and yet here he is. And so basically I want to show the lawyer hands him a photo of Trump with this accuser, Carol, as well as Marla Maples, leading to this exchange.
You have in front of you a black and white photograph that we've marked as DJT23. And I'm going to ask you, is this the photo that you were just referring to?
I think so, yes.
Okay. And do you recall when you first saw this photo?
At some point during the process, I saw it. That's, I guess, her husband, John Johnson, who was an anchor for ABC. Nice guy. I thought, I mean, I don't know him, but I thought he was pretty good at what he did. I don't even know who the woman, let's see, I don't know who, it's Marla.
You say Marla's in this photo?
That's Marla, yeah. That's my wife.
Which woman are you pointing to? No.
Here.
Carol.
Oh, is that,
the person you just pointed to was
I
Jean
see.
Carroll.
Who is that? Who is this?
Point, your wife. And the woman on the right is your then wife,
I don't know.
Ivana?
This was the picture.
Ivana.
I assume that's John Johnson. Is that
That's Carol?
Because it's very blurry.
What do you see there in that exchange? Because we're so used to this voluble Trump, and his fans have a certain idea of him. And here he really seems to be kind of running out the clock or using a lot of words to just not say anything about the photo.
Not only is he using a lot of words, I mean, on the back of the fact that he said she's just not my type, he married Marla Maples. This woman looks just like Marla Maples at that time. So that flies in the face of whatever kind of weird defense he thinks he has. And so again, this is the worst possible type of evidence, I think, in a case like this, which is he said, she said, in a sense. It's circumstantial and it's happened a long time ago. Memories fade. But this puts you right there and right then. And let's also remember, he's not in the courtroom. Most defendants that are being accused of something as heinous as sexual assault, whether it be a criminal defendant or a civil defendant, would you not want to get into that courtroom and defend yourself? He's not there.
Yeah.
But this puts him in the courtroom and puts him in a way that's very unflattering. Again, I would say this was a very, very, very good day for that civil defense, for that civil attorney.
Right, which we're only learning about now that we can actually see the video. The last little piece I have is sort of the inflection or perhaps the national moment to revisit what happened in 16. And some people are understandably tired of it. And yet I think we should keep in mind that the video we're about to see, which is, again, the Access Hollywood, is not being offered in a political context. It's not being offered in a Trump documentary. It is being brought forward by the lawyers representing the woman who says that she sought this accountability in court. So it is in that context that this is back out here. And we don't usually see this, which is Trump in this setting sort of just sitting through it. Let's take a look.
I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the do anything.
This is just, again, in the deposition, him sort of sitting through it,
Yes.
which they've released. Both in law but in life, given your history here, what do you think America takes from all of this now that he did lose the vote, fewer people voted for him, but he was elected to the Electoral College even after that was exposed.
Right.
A lot of people and women's advocates looked at that as this sort of unacceptable affirmation. Me Too movement came out of that, partly related to the tectonic plates under Trump. And here he is now at least being held accountable in the civil context for, we'll see what the jury says, but for this alleged assault.
Well, what I saw on that tape is I don't need consent. They let you do it. I don't need consent to kiss someone. I don't need to consent to touch someone. I can touch them by their genitals because I'm a star. You always need consent for any sort of unwanted touching, for any sort of touching. And here he is in a case where he is accused of unwanted touching, unwanted sexual assault.
Yeah.
And he is saying, but I don't need the consent anyway.
Yeah.
Again, I think this type of evidence is perhaps even stronger than having him on the witness stand denying anything.
Than doing what someone else would do. It's really interesting, and it goes to sort of America sort of absorbing all this, which is why we think it's important that Carol sort of brought all this forward.
Absolutely.
We're going to make what we call in the business the hard turn. Right? This is a serious topic, which we wanted to hit.
I like serious topics.
You know, I know you do. But while I have you, I want to hear about your new book. I always keep it real with everyone when I can.
Yes.
And the reality is, we would have you on way more if we could. It's only when you're on a book tour
I know.
we get you over from
You know
review.
I love you.
Well, so I'm thrilled to have you here. And, you know, people do more than one thing. You are working your pen.
Yeah.
Your pen is hot.
Yeah.
You're writing fiction. We'll put this up. It's Summer on Sag Harbor. And you look at, among other things, the sort of the notion of a historically black community that's over in this beach area. I was thinking about, you know, we say HBCs, historically black colleges.
Yes.
This is like maybe, and I'm just freestyling here, but maybe HBBs, the historically black beach vibes. Tell us about
this. It's HBBC, and it is very much like an HBCU. And I will tell you what's fascinating about the community in Sag Harbor. I've been summering there for about 20 years. The community worked really hard to get it federally registered as an HBBC, a historic black beach community.
Black beach community. There we go.
You're plugged in. You're plugged in, Ari. You know that. And I decided to write this trilogy. Actually, I thought it was just going to be one book, but my editor said it was 3, setting these stories in places where black people were allowed to buy property.
Yeah.
And it's even hard to say that, just allowed to buy property. Yeah. And that was Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard. They were welcomed there in the late 1800s. And then also Sag Harbor in the late 30s. And then Highland Beach in Maryland. And Frederick Douglass had a summer home there with his white wife. And so I was always fascinated by the history that we always hear about black trauma. We hear about black poverty. We rarely hear about black excellence and the fact that black folks did have some generational wealth, certainly not as much as others in this country, but it exists, and those enclaves exist because I summer there. It's a safe place for my children. It's a safe haven for me. It's a real community, and I wanted people to know, hey, this exists. But then I also wanted it to be a beach read with, you know, a little sex, a little fun, and this story explores Olivia Jones's story, and I think her story is going to be very relatable because it's about a woman who, she knows she deserves more, but she's suffering from the imposter syndrome. She's beautiful, she's accomplished, but she doesn't feel like she deserves love. And I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Sure, and that's the universal part. I love it. I didn't know you were going to say black excellence.
Yeah.
But did Jay-Z not say opulence?
Yes.
Black excellence?
Yes.
Tuxes next to the president.
See,
I stink of success.
See, I love that.
It smells so sweet. The new black elite.
The new black elite.
So here we are.
This is almost the old guard.
Well, so to the old guard, that's what I was going to ask you about the writing of it. So
yeah.
Everyone tries to write what they know and their truth.
Yeah.
How much of this, when you're writing, feels like thoughts that have already been kicking around and you're just kind of doing them in fiction mode? And how much of it is you researching, prepping, or making it up? That
This is
fiction
historical fiction.
Historical.
And that was very, very important to me. I started with Our Kind of People, which was written by Lawrence Graham. He was a dear friend of mine. He passed away. And he wrote about the Divine Nine, which I'm sure you are familiar with. I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. He wrote about Jack and Jill. He wrote about the Lynx. And he wrote about these beachfront properties, these HBBCs. And I thought, I'm going to write to that. And so everything that you read in my books, they're all accurate, all these places. And I was actually in Martha's Vineyard last year, and a lot of the stores welcomed me and thanked me. They said some of their profits went up about 100 to 200% because people read the book and then they went and visited. So it's history.
I love that.
And it's fiction, too.
But that's what we always study, those of us who love culture, right? You wrote the book, and the people want the experience because the life follows the art informs the life. I love that.
Aspirational.
Amen. Yeah. Well, I think we covered more than one thing. I love having you. You're such a joy.
Thank you.
Such a nice presence to have on a Friday.
Thank
here.
you for having me, my friend.
As we get towards the weekend. The book, if you want to get it yourself, is Summer on Sag Harbor. Now, I told you it's a busy Friday. Let me tell you why. If you joined us a couple minutes late, President Biden, MSNBC exclusive with Stephanie Rule. You're going to see the first footage of that tonight right here in this hour. Later, guess who's back? Fab Five Freddy with John Kasich. I can tell you as a factual matter, it's the first time they've appeared on television together. We're proud to host them tonight on The Beat. But first, an important story as we look at ethics and grifting and the Thomases putting a cloud over the whole Supreme Court. My commentary for you when we're back in just 60 seconds. Turning to the widening grifting and ethics scandal that surrounds not only Clarence Thomas, but his family. It includes his wife because the reports keep coming. And now it touches on one of the most powerful insider activists on Supreme Court Republican and conservative pressure in the country. This is one of those people, like some of these billionaires that we sometimes cover, who is so important even if he's not a household name. But he is on the court, and he is in the Republican Party. I've mentioned him before briefly on our broadcast. His name is Leonard Leo. And he leads a group you probably have heard of, the Federalist Society. He's worked with them for a long time, and he has a separate legal group. And they have been, over the years, in different formulations, very instrumental in the process of how Republican presidents put people on the Supreme Court. The Washington Post has reported about how Mr. Leonard Leo arranged for Ginny Thomas to be paid tens of thousands of dollars in 2012 and then specified, and this is the new reporting from old payments, that her name be left off billing paperwork. And here is a quote. No mention of Ginny, of course. Leo also basically had a very well-known Trump aide, Kellyanne Conway, involved to get this all done. Now, this is, again, according to Washington Post reporting, it was basically an arrangement where one of these groups that Leo works with, his entity, would then put money towards Conway's firm, and this was earmarked as consulting. Then Conway would take that money and give it to Ginny Thomas's firm. And this was a lot of money to most people, over $80,000. Now, it's not known what money she did. I should say what work she did for that money. And let me be clear, while this might be technically legal because they can spend money on things, it clearly was a scheme to make this hidden and secret from the public. And it's the kind of mechanism that is also associated with money laundering because you're hiding the origin of the funds. Then, as you see on the bottom of this chart that we made, on the same year, Leonard Leo's same group filed a brief in a voting case with the Supreme Court that reaches Justice Thomas. Conservatives on the court then ruled the way that they were hoping, and they struck down the Voting Rights Act. No mention of Ginny Thomas, but a lot of connections here. Now, in response to this Post report, Leo says, quote, "It's no secret Thomas has a long history of working on issues with the conservative movement. I've always tried to protect the privacy of Justice Thomas and Ginny." Now, the issue here is not privacy. And while I want to be careful to note that nothing in the Post is currently alleging that this scheme itself was, for example, illegal, it raises a lot of issues beyond privacy because we're talking about not someone's personal medical situation or their personal family situation. We're talking about public work related to government employment on the Supreme Court. Now, Leo's very powerful in this world. Back in 2016, he was the person that Donald Trump sat down with to create that public list of the potential justices that Trump might appoint. And a little bit of context to remind you about why this was such a big deal. Donald Trump had captured the grassroots of the Republican Party. He was clearly surging and then the nominee, but he had a problem still with aspects of that coalition, the pro-life part and the legal part. There are a lot of businesses and other important entities on the right that work very closely to try to make sure they know who's going to make it on the court. And Trump was seen, I think rightly so, as a wild card. So think about how important Leonard Leo was, that he was the top person with the precedent in the history to sit down with Trump and decide or discuss who might end up on the court. Now, I'll tell you, I mentioned that Leo is important. I did, a couple of years back, interview him. This was at Cornell Law, where, if relevant, I can mention we both graduated from at different times. And we discussed this very powerful perch he had advising Trump on that list.
It was Donald Trump, the candidate, Don McGahn, his general counsel, and myself. I had gotten a little bit of a tip-off that this was his idea, so I happened to have a list. And at one point he said, so what kinds of people would you put on that list? I said, well, I happen to have would you like to see it?
Would you like to see it? Now, he's being a little arch, and that's a crowd of lawyers kind of appreciating his process. But again, the point is, that list in his pocket was a bunch of names that he was providing on behalf of sort of his project, those groups I mentioned, to tell Donald Trump, these are names you could say that we approve of. And Trump did put out that list, and he has then later, of course, put in people on the court that fit largely with that sort of Federalist Society type credentials. Now, we also in this exchange discussed many issues, and I had asked about credibility issues on the court. Here's some of that.
I don't think that the role of the Chief Justice is to have a unique role in defending the reputation and credibility of the court. The best way for every justice of the court to do that is to do what they think is right when they render decisions, and not try to play politics.
Every justice should do what's right, not play politics, and then he argued the Chief Justice wouldn't have to get involved in perhaps overseeing them or drawing lines. Well, that standard is failing, not by all the justices on the court, but by Justice Thomas, it is. I mean, you can't just go out here and take secret payments of millions of dollars and then go rule on cases and then lecture the country and issue rulings about fairness and transparency and right and wrong, or can you? There clearly is an attitude over there by Justice Thomas and others that they're going to get away with all of this. They are practically daring Congress to act or the Chief Justice to act, and we will see. We will stay on the case of whether they do. That is our update on an important story tonight. Coming up in the hour, there are newly revealed texts out of Fox. We have the President Biden exclusive and Stephanie Rule. Stay with us. We have breaking news here at MSNBC because our next guest is an MSNBC colleague who just wrapped the biggest interview you can get in government, an exclusive sit-down interview you see there with President Biden. This is actually his first such interview since announcing his bid for re-election. And our guest is that journalist, Stephanie Rule, hosts the 11th Hour on MSNBC, live from the White House. Stephanie, congratulations on the interview. We're going to play some of it, but first, the floor is yours to tell us what you learned in your big exclusive.
Thank you so much, Ari. There was a lot to cover, but we had to cover the debt ceiling, right? The president has a strong economic recovery story to tell, but in less than 4 weeks, when the government cannot pay its bills, all those wins could fly out the window. So what is he doing? He is trying to make his case to the American people so they will understand how the debt ceiling works, what the Republicans are looking to cut, and try to get the American people fired up enough so they reach out to their lawmakers. But here's the problem, Ari. This is a far more volatile Congress, you know this, than the Congress he served with years ago. There are members of Congress, Republicans in Congress, who would be A-OK if we defaulted because they think it'll be politically worse for Joe Biden. So I asked him, when negotiating with Kevin McCarthy, does he view McCarthy as an honest broker? And here's what he said. Is Kevin McCarthy an honest broker for you to negotiate with?
I think he's an honest man. I think he's in a position, though, he had to make a deal that was pretty, 15 votes. 15 votes that where he just about sold away everything that the far, far right. There's a Republican Party and there's the MAGA Republicans. And the MAGA Republicans really have put him in a position where, in order to stay Speaker, he has to agree. He's agreed to things that maybe he believes, but are just extreme.
Given the power that they have, is there anything you believe you can get done in the next 2 years on a bipartisan basis? And if so, what?
The answer is yes, I do, if I get a chance to get votes. They have to vote.
He did say that he would not rule out invoking the 14th Amendment, which basically means that we would blow through the debt ceiling and they would keep on trucking. That is noteworthy. But of course, Ari, we had to talk about the fact that he just announced he is running for re-election. And for a lot of people, the elephant in the room is the president's age. I can tell you at 47, I've lost a little on my fastball, and he needs to make a case to the American people. He does. Why he's the best man for the job. And I want you to watch what he had to say, because I'm going to tell you, he got fired up. There's not a Fortune 500 company in the world looking to hire a CEO in his 80s. So why would an 82-year-old Joe Biden be the right person for the most important job in the world?
Because I've acquired a hell of a lot of wisdom. I know more than the vast majority of people. I'm more experienced than anybody who's ever run for the office. And I think I've proven myself to be honorable as well as also effective.
You know, Ari, in his announcement video, though, he had Vice President Kamala Harris featured 10 times. Now, when Obama was running for re-election, he didn't feature Joe Biden. So the question for this White House, are they elevating VP Harris? Because critics are saying, is this president going to be able to serve another 4 years? He's saying absolutely no doubt, but she's his partner in this.
Yeah, and Stephanie, there are many reasons why he wants to be talking. We mentioned this is the first since they declared re-election campaign. You obviously, as you just mentioned, pressed him on that. What else comes through to you sort of in the mood and the feel of it? As you and I know, sometimes there's what's said and then there's how he seemed, how it seemed at the White House, how the aides seemed, what's going on out there. And I know we're going to have so much more, and everyone should tune in tonight in the 11th hour coverage. But if you can tell us a little bit about what else you gleaned doing the reporting and being there with the president tonight.
I think he wants to run against Donald Trump. I think when he ran in 2020 and it was all about, fighting for the soul of America, he wants to continue to do that. But think about this. This soul of America, in the last 2 years, hate crimes are up, random acts of violence and divisions are deep. He is committed to running again, but also because think about this. Infrastructure spending, rebuilding America, bringing jobs back. This is what he's wanted to do for decades. And I would say his biggest frustration is passing the bipartisan infrastructure law was a massive achievement that he doesn't get that much credit for because you don't see it. So the question is, in the next year to 2 years, will there be enough shovels in the ground that people in red states and blue states say, I'm not forgotten. America is getting rebuilt. That's going to be a really big challenge for him. He got huge stuff passed, and we don't see it. And he's going to need that to translate for him because it's not at this point in the polls. So he's got to be out there talking about it.
Yeah, you make great points. I got to say, Stephanie, there's big interviews. And then there's pivotal times. You have a big interview at this pivotal time, fresh off the re-elect announcement. Super interesting. Thank you for working all day and night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm so glad you could share some of the excerpts with us on the beat, but there's so much more. So let me show folks on the screen. This is actually a special 2-hour edition of the 11th hour. So yes, you see the 11, but we recommend starting at 10 p.m. when Stephanie will be anchoring for 2 hours, including the full and exclusive MSNBC interview with the president tonight. Now, coming up, I want to tell you we have so much more. We like to do interesting things to end the week. We're going to get into the artificial intelligence issues. There was actually a Biden meeting about this recently. AI might have been politics, tech, labor. There's good and bad. We're going to get into it with our special guest. But first, something I mentioned earlier, this Fox evidence train has not stopped running down the tracks, and it's ensnared another anchor. New secret texts, no longer secret. They're revealed. I got them for you next. Lordy, there are tapes, and Lordy, there are texts. More Fox News texts. This time from Bret Baier, who's always said he's the big straight news anchor over there. Well, he was caught plotting privately with Tucker Carlson, now ousted, and these new texts obtained by the Daily Beast. We here at MSNBC have not confirmed or obtained them. Tell a story. On November 5th, this is 3 days after the election, Carlson secretly writes to Bear, "We could lose our audience." And Bear responds, "We've been pushing for answers. I have pressed them to slow. And I think they will slow walk Nevada. The votes don't come in until tomorrow." Does this sound like a straight news reporter, like someone at the AP who is just following the election results and going to tell you what they find? Or does it sound like, in this text, that Bret Baier is panicked and worried that if he says true things that the audience doesn't like, it'll be bad, and so they at least want to slow that down? Then Carlson writes, quote, "When Trump loses," so they knew that was coming, "he's going to blame us. That's going to be very bad. I've got 4 more years here." Well, that didn't turn out to be true. "I'm stuck with Fox." That didn't turn out to be true. He goes on to write, "Got to do whatever I can to keep our numbers up and our viewers happy." Now, Baier, again, who says he's the straight news guy, talking to Carlson, writes back, "Yes." So compare that to this.
Does the president watch your show?
I know he watches my show. Obviously, I think he likes the opinion shows a little bit better than the news shows on Fox.
Fair, balanced, and unafraid. You've been saying that a lot on your show.
Yeah. That was the tagline that when I took over for Brit Hume, fair, balanced, not afraid. When I took over the show, I said, "Brit, can I keep the tagline?" And so now I sometimes I say fair, balanced, and still unafraid.
Unafraid or afraid that saying things that were true, they both evinced the knowledge Trump was going to lose, but saying that or saying that in a timely manner, which is how live news works, would upset the audience, which they were afraid of. Caught. Now, we checked in with Fox, and I want to share the response they gave regarding the calls. They say Fox News stood by that Arizona call, which was the big one that went against Trump despite intense scrutiny. They go on to say that there was a narrow margin there and add, quote, "It's hardly surprising there'd be postmortem discussions surrounding the call and how it was executed." Fox also points to something that Baier said in September 2022. "I fully supported our decision desk's call and would defend it on air." So there is at least a tension here, if not an outright contradiction, between talk of unafraid, courageous, real-time facts, no matter what the response is, and what the texts in private show. More and more evidence coming out from that defamation case. Now, when we come back, AI offers so much promise and so many warnings. The godfather of AI, someone who's actually really important in that space, just quit his main operation with a warning for us. We're going to get into that with some very special guests next. Artificial intelligence seems to be everywhere these days, and a Google engineer who's known as one of its godfathers just issued a warning and quit based on his concerns.
We need to think really hard now about how we're going to control something that's more intelligent than us. What I'm talking about is the existential threat of this kind of digital intelligence taking over from biological intelligence.
The idea that these robots could actually take over is not just science fiction, and here's how the government's dealing with it. The president and vice president just talked to top tech CEOs about the risks. The White House has a new plan to try to look more closely at that. We have 2 very special guests to get into all of it in a special segment right now. Fab Five Freddy is a visual artist, filmmaker, architect of the street art movement. He first exploded on the scene in the 70s as a major graffiti artist and expert. He helped hip-hop break mainstream. You may remember him from something we love, Yo MTV Raps. Nowadays, he owns his own cannabis line and pushes social justice. He has a podcast series for the 50th anniversary of hip-hop and is a returning alumni of The Beat in all its forms. Good to see you.
How are you, Ari?
Good.
Nice to be here. And nice to meet the good governor who I've watched many
this is
times.
What you're paired with heavy hitter John Kasich, Republican congressman, governor of Ohio, presidential candidate, the author of 5 books, including 2 Paths, America Divided or United, and It's Up to Us, 10 little ways we can bring about big change, and, you know, Yo MTV GOP if you want.
Yeah, no, I was speaking with the governor back there, telling him a little bit about my background. A lot of people think because of my name, Fab Five Freddy, I'm a rapper, but no, I'm one of the people that made hip-hop happen, and I create, you know, filmmaking, visual art.
And hip-hop is more than the music, right? It's the whole culture you were a part of. We're seeing, you talk about music, I mean, we're seeing huge clashes already over who owns what, who gets credit, et cetera. Governor?
No, listen, you have
Drake. They had some fake Drake album. I mean, maybe he should go with AI because the thing was just going over the top, and they realized it really wasn't Drake, right? I mean, it's just amazing. I
heard a Biggie Smalls doing one of the songs from Nas's first album.
I heard that.
Was so incredible. I think
they have the AI, the robot Biggie. At the end of that, one of the verses, he starts to run out of breath.
Oh boy!
But it's like because they impersonated what it would sound like if Biggie did a verse that fast.
I think artists are going to have to embrace it and figure out effective ways of using it. In hip-hop, we have a thing called the mixtape, which often has remixes of different songs and songs that are not released. I think that's a cool way to play with it.
Today, we're getting warned by all these people, my God, the end of the earth is coming. Well, no, give me a solution. Give me a solution, because we're not going to stop the development of these things. These technologies are coming at us like trying to stop the waves on an ocean.
Absolutely.
Right? So let's figure out how to deal with it, how to regulate it, and how to get people to be able to use their good minds to separate fact from fiction.
What's really scary, though, is the film and this scenario, God forbid this happens, is HAL 9000. This was the AI robot in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey who takes over the ship. Watch that film, and that's the scenario we don't want to see happen. AI experts say we're not there yet with a thinking AI.
Singularity, right?
You've got to...
But Fab, you are something. I mean, you're like a philosopher. You're not, I mean, you're not just a... You know, some musician here. You've thought about it all. I'm not that there's anything wrong with musicians. I wish I was one.
I got my PhD in the University of the Streets, Brooklyn and now Harlem, where I reside. That's it, baby. You know?
Well, it's funny you mentioned this about the law catching up, right? Because you say, okay, AI can do some positive things. You're talking about the science fiction warning us. A lot of techno-futurists have said if this isn't regulated at all, it could go really south. So I guess the larger question is, what do you think Congress should do right now, if anything, so we know where AI is headed?
Well, first of all, they don't understand that what Congress has to do on some of these very complicated things is bring the best and the brightest in and then figure out what we do. Because we're not going to shut it down.
No.
But it's got to be put in its place. And look at this Chat GPT. And, you know, we could have a computer here, and they could tell your whole history. We could write a speech for you right here in 2 seconds. These things are okay, but what we have to do is figure out what's right, what's not right. How are there proper guardrails around these emerging?
You mentioned that.
What it's known as
right?
it's called prompt engineering. Now, the prompts is the secret sauce of AI. You got to feed it the right information.
Exactly. So Fab, like
get the right out.
So we had Erica Badu here. And I read to her.
Yes.
We read to Erica what ChatGPT said about her work, synthesizing her work.
Have you seen any of these artificial intelligence systems like ChatGPT? What is that? So it's brand new. I went into this machine, and this is what the artificial intelligence spit back. Badu incorporates elements of spirituality and mysticism into her music. Her music can be seen as a form of resistance against dominant cultural narratives and a celebration of alternative ways of being.
Wow. Feel like my ancestors wrote that.
When it's used well, it is sifting through the best or the most representative of everything that every human has ever said about her work.
That's right. Billions and billions of data bits.
Look at AI now being able to look at the images from when we go to figure out if we break something, or they're starting to say that AI, because of the ability to look at patterns, could make a prognosis for somebody where people could get treated for something.
On the medical side.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
exciting. Yes.
You know what? New ideas can always be, look,
fucking mouse.
Twitter is
Oh, fucking Nora. What is fucking wrong with this cunt? this. Oh, this is really fucking beginning to annoy me. Oh, come on, you cunt! Oh, God, of all the fucking time for you to fuck around. Oh, it's not. I fucking give up. Oh, come on, you cunt. Fucking thing.